Hello, listeners, and welcome to Critical Conversations by Hlanganisa, where we spotlight the untold stories that are the essence of our social fabric. In this special series, we join activists, leaders, policymakers, and ordinary citizens as we commemorate 16 days of activism against gender-based violence perpetrated against women and children. I'm your host, Bongi Wendondo, and today we spotlight an often invisible group of women we call auntie or refer to as helpers, and are often exposed to unprecedented levels of gender-based violence in our homes. It is estimated that there are over 1 million domestic workers in South Africa, most of them in the cities of Johannesburg, Cape Town, and Durban. With us to unpack these issues further is Maggie, a former domestic worker who co-founded Izwi Domestic Workers Alliance, an organization that seeks to raise awareness and provide capacity development to domestic workers around their labor and social rights. Critical matters requiring candid conversations. Maggie, thank you for joining us. I'm really glad that you were able to make it and talk about this important issue. You know, often when we talk about domestic workers, we think about all the labor rights issues. And yet there's more to, the plight of domestic workers than just labor rights. Just from your own experience, what makes domestic workers particularly vulnerable to sexual violence?
Well, thank you. I'm going to introduce myself. My name is Maggie from Izwi Domestic Workers Alliance. I am a former domestic worker for more than 15 years, and I'm one of the co-founders of Izwi Domestic Workers Alliance organization. Yes, I'm going to respond to your question. I think it's just because domestic workers, they're just working from their employer's private house. So the employers, they don't think that domestic workers, as they are working to them, especially those who are working live-in, is their offices where they are working, is their home as well. So that's the reason why they are being abused on gender-based violence, just because they are doing everything, where they're even touching their employers' private things. They are even cleaning their bedrooms. It's even easier to be abused on gender-based violence in domestic workers sector just because you are everywhere in the house.
That's interesting. You make mention of live-in domestic workers. Do you think that it's worse for live-in domestic workers?
It is, just because it's their home at the same time as their workplace, because sometimes domestic workers, live-in domestic workers, they don't knock off at 4. They're working more than minimum hours because the employers think that just because they're not going to be traveling at home, so they can even wake up to late because they're not going to be traveling. So it's more, I'm not sure which word I can use, because for those who are doing live out, it's easier because they might even travel home at after hours, around like after 4, and then those who are working live in, they can even wake up to 10.
I'm actually just reminded for a lot of families, domestic workers actually sleep with the children. And for any mother, for any parent, your children's room is one of those rooms that you walk in and out of. And I would imagine that some of the, lack of privacy for domestic workers also makes them quite vulnerable to sexual abuse. Would you say that?
Which is true, because we did have this one of the domestic worker who was staying in, and then she was sleeping with the child, and then at night the child was crying, and then the domestic worker didn't hear that the child was crying because she was fast asleep, and then the male employer have to wake up and try to knock, and then I don't think he even knocked. He opened the door, and then until he shake the domestic worker to tell her that the child is crying. So it's not even safe at all, because they are using their employers' baby rooms.
That's actually interesting. What would you say, again, from your own experience, what would you say are some of the circumstances that make this worse? You've spoken about the issue of living domestic workers and that it's worse for them. What about some of the issues such as, the migrant status of domestic workers? What are some of the things that actually make it worse for domestic workers?
Yeah, it make it worse because most of domestic workers, especially female domestic workers, are single parents. And then when they go at work during the interviewing time, they even mention that I am single. And then they know that the employers know that even they don't have partners who might even come in sometimes. And then especially when it comes to migrant workers, they vulnerable more than some other domestic workers because they can't even be able to report the matters. They don't even know that South Africa have laws that they can cover even if you are undocumented. So they can't report, fearing that they might even lose their job because at the same time, most of domestic workers, they are breadwinners at home. So especially even those migrant workers, they are migrant workers who are undocumented and they are migrant domestic workers who are documented. So especially those who are undocumented, it's bad worse to them because most of the times when you open the case on the Department of Labor side, the Department of Labor, when they go, they visit employers' homes, they go with Home Affairs, whereby the Department of Labor inspectors, they are going to be dealing with the employers, and then the Home Affairs also is going to be dealing with the employee. At the same time, the employer is going to win because the Home Affairs is going to take the domestic worker with them.
So that's also a gap in our laws and how we're implementing those laws.
It is because no matter what, most of the employers, they are now choosing to employ migrant and documented domestic workers, knowing that they're even going to win wherever they are because Department of Labor, when they goes, Department of Labor, they're going to tell the employers about the registration. At the same time, you can't register a domestic worker if she's not undocumented. And then some of the domestic workers employers, they do now register them, knowing that they can't claim. They deduct that money, knowing that they'll never claim because of the documentation.
You know, we talk about sexual violence, but there's also elements of sexual exploitation, you know, where the domestic workers themselves might actually consent, whether knowingly or unknowing, or whether they are coerced or not. But there are some instances where domestic workers have consented to sexual relations with employers that sometimes, you know, often go wrong and leaving the domestic worker vulnerable. How prevalent is that, would you say?
I can say, like most of domestic workers, especially those who are doing live-in, they don't have private. Sometimes they're sharing the bathroom with the employers. And then there's some other employers who can even step in the bathroom without even knocking, knowing that the domestic worker is inside. And then they're going to be using that power that this is my house. So the domestic worker, even if it was during her bad time, she would take the towel and come outside. So it's very it's something which we don't even know how we're going to end this. And then especially some other employers, they even can't educate their kids about uh, gender-based violence on domestic workers, because we did have the case which was very painful. We ended up losing this case because the woman was older than the child, and then this child, I think he pretended that he was sick on the day, and then he didn't go to school, and then during the day the lady was cleaning, and then it was around her time to knock off, and then she feel like, I can't just leave the house before I check this boy. And then she had to knock to the room, and then the boy said, come in. And then she said, no, I'm about to knock off, but since morning I didn't see you, so I just want to check, how are you, as you said you are not feeling well.
Right.
And then this boy said, oh, I'm not feeling well, can you please help me to rub my chest and my back? As we all believe that when you have flu, if you rub your chest and your back, you feel better. And then the lady said, no, it's fine, because the child was 17 and the lady was 40 something. And then the lady said, I'm fine, I can rub you. And then the boy said, okay, you start with my back. And then he slept down. And then she did rub his back. And then after that, she did rub his chest. Before she finished, the son woke up, and then she locked the door and say, you have to take off your clothes. And then she was raped. And then she screamed, and then the security came in. The secretary said, you can call the parents, and then they did call the parents. The parents came, and then it turned because she was older than that boy, so she's the one who abused the boy. So she ended up losing her marriage because the husband said, no, I think you're the one, because the child is young.
Yeah.
So according to the South African Constitution, she lost the case just like that, but she was abused.
Oh, that's actually very sad. And,
And then there was another lady who, she is still working there. And then the male employer told her that you are not allowed to wear some underpants.
Oh dear.
Mm-hmm. And then one day she's working Monday to Friday, and then on Saturday she was ordered to come and do some part-time job, and then she went there, and then the male employer said, today you are here just to massage me, and then I'm going to pay more than I'm paying for being a domestic worker.
Right.
And then she did. She massaged the employer until it ended. She was raped. Right. And then now, just because the employer, he is protecting her marriage, he said to this lady, whenever you report this matter and then my wife find out, I'm going to kill you. Yeah. But she's still working there. Because she's a migrant domestic worker, and then she's undocumented, and then she don't want to lose this job because she's a single parent at the same time she's a breadwinner.
I would imagine that is actually very difficult. I'm trying to imagine a situation where I'm married, my husband has sexual relations with the domestic worker. If the domestic worker reported, I would imagine that she would still lose her job. So it doesn't matter whichever way you do it, you are likely to lose your job anyway. Domestic workers are actually between a rock and a hard place.
They don't have any choice because, like during COVID-19, the time COVID-19 started, we believed that when you steam, you're going to be better. Yes. And then there was a domestic worker who was steaming in her back room. Yes. And then the employer said, you can't believe that you are steaming. You have to steam in front of us. Yeah. And then the lady didn't have any choice, even though she was uncomfortable, because they said you have to steam because all of us in the house were steaming, but we can't even believe that we're steaming because we're steaming alone. And then she had to steam. She was wearing her unders, and then the employer said, no, you have to take it off.
Oh my goodness.
And then she said, no, I can't take it off in front of the kids. And then the male employer even said, you can go to your room and then I'll come there. I want to see you steaming.
Oh my goodness.
And then the lady went to her room. The male employer followed. And then she was always steaming in front of that guy. Yeah. Every day. It was an everyday thing.
My goodness. Would you say that there's any race dynamics to this? Do you find it common amongst Black families that employ Black domestic workers, white families that employ Black domestic workers? What would you say?
I'm sorry to say this, but most of the time Indians are more like, I don't even know when they look at domestic work what they see. I don't think they see a human being. I think they see somebody like a monkey with hands. They can help. Because the only thing which they need, I think, is only domestic workers' hands, nothing more, because they don't even think that they can think. But when it comes to Black and white, it's fine. Most of the Black now, they know about Ubuntu. So this is, even if I was a domestic worker, I was working for Black, I preferred them because they know everything about Ubuntu.
So you think that Black to Black relations tend to work a little bit better in relation to what we're talking about?
It is, but when it comes to finance, they are the one who are not following complying on the.
So you win some, you lose others.
Yes.
But tell me something. I'm just, based on what you've just said, if there's if you are a domestic worker and you happen to have a white or even a Black employer, for instance, and you, for whatever reason, find yourself in that difficult situation where you are coerced or you are forced into sexual relations and so on and so forth, to what extent do you think domestic workers actually understand their rights and understand that the situation with the situation that they're in, they can actually access justice in some shape or form?
The thing is, because of money can buy everything. So some domestic workers, they know that it's a no. If it's a no, they know that this is a no, this is a yes. But just because of the word lawyers, most of the employers, they keep on saying, my lawyer, my lawyer, my lawyer. So most of domestic workers, they don't even know what is behind of that, the word lawyer. So even if they know that I have to report this matter, but I don't have a lawyer, and then my employers keep on preaching the word lawyers, not even lawyer, which even you can tell that it's not even one. So the only thing which you have to do is to educate domestic workers about what is a lawyer, what lawyer do, Because most of the employers, they keep on saying, lawyers, my lawyers, my lawyers. And then as a domestic worker, I say, I don't have a domestic worker. So even if I report this matter, I'm going to lose because the guy or the lady does have lawyers. Now they change. They say, I have lawyers in Anthony's. So,
so tell me something. So if you were looking for what do you think needs to be done to protect domestic workers? I know we've already started talking about, we need to educate them about the laws. They need to be aware of their rights. They need to. What else do you think can be done to protect domestic workers?
I think first we can educate domestic workers about not only about their labor issues, about gender-based violence at work, and then also I think we have to work with domestic workers, employers organizations, domestic workers employers organization, to educate their clients. As domestic workers employers organization, those employers are their clients. I think they have to be educated also about how to treat a domestic worker. I think the other thing is to educate employers to, when they hire a domestic worker, I think I prefer as a domestic worker to have a contract with a female employer, not with a male. But most of the times they do a contract with a male because financially most houses, male are the breadwinners, so they prefer to have a contract with the male. So any conversation in the house, you're going to be telling that guy until you're used to him, and then until they start to click their eyes, you don't even know what does this mean. And then so yeah, I think the education is supposed to be, and then I think also we have to engage the pro bonos lawyers to try to stand up for domestic workers, not only for human rights, but when it comes to cover and say specifically for domestic workers, because they now don't know where to find justice, and then because most of the times when the employer say lawyers, as a domestic worker, you don't have a lawyer. You don't even know if pro bono lawyers, they can cover domestic workers.
Yes. And I'm also just wondering whether we could have facilities like helplines that domestic workers can call, maybe a toll-free line that they can call, and on the other side be able to be given assistance, even if it's just assistance that relates to what rights you have as a domestic worker. Maybe that would also help. As you were talking, I was just reminded, you spoke about educating the employers. I'm just wondering, do you think that the employers don't understand what they are doing? Because I would imagine that, on the one hand, we tend to despise domestic workers. What you're saying about the Indian community especially. We tend to despise domestic workers and almost treat them in a very inhumane way. But, on the other hand, we're quite happy to have sexual relations with them or sexual engagement with them. I'm just reminded of slavery, where your masters despised you, and yet they were quite happy to, on the side, engage in sexual relations with black women, to a point where in some of the slave communities, we ended up seeing a whole population of mixed race children, arising from these relations. And yet, on the one hand, your slave is your property. You treat them in an inhumane way. They are, subhuman and so on and so forth. Do you think that employers do it because they don't understand or they don't know? I would imagine that they actually know, but are taking advantage of the situation.
No, the thing is, I'm going to go back to the Department of Labor by not forcing their laws, because most of domestic workers' employers, they don't call domestic worker as a worker. You are a helper, which means I can help you in everything, which is going to be. So most of them, why they don't want to give those domestic workers contract and pay slip, like being treated like workers, is just because they want to call them aunties or helpers. So if I'm an auntie, I can do whatever you want me to do. You can order me to do whatever I want to. And then just because of my situation back, I will do that, because most of the times domestic workers, they know that this is a no. And then even employers, I think they do know that this is a no. Because there is a domestic worker who said she was raped. But it was not a rape as such, it was an agreement somehow. And then she said she was working and then she was getting paid 6,000. I think the male employer is a bio. So
What do you mean by bio?
she is a gay, and then
he's bisexual.
Is bisexual. So this lady, the main employer said to her, you are getting paid 6,000. I'm asking you to help me, and then I'll put 4,000. But you make sure that my wife doesn't find out about this. And then the male said, you can think about it. I'm not pushing you. And then she thought about it, and then the male come again. She was pushing for find the outcome. And then the lady, when she was sharing the story, as she said, I am not a virgin anymore. I have kids. So why I'm not helping this guy, because he's going to pay me this 4,000, and then I'm going to be earning 4,000 per month. I don't have a partner of which I can just say yes. And then she ended up saying yes. But still, I think it was abuse, because the male used his power just because he's an employer. And then he knew that it was wrong, because he said to her, think about it. I'm not pushing, I'm not forcing, but if you want. So he was only using this lady on the other side, using his wife on the other side. So he was like, he had this combo in the one room, in one house.
That's the way you put it. Tell me something, Maggie. What kind of solidarity exists between domestic workers? What kind of support systems do domestic workers have with each other, amongst each other?
We do have a very big solidarity, but only to those domestic workers who are working in rural areas. Is difficult because it can be network, it can be smartphones. So it's very difficult for us, even organization and union, to reach them, which means I think the most of the issues that are even happening, especially to those who are working in rural areas, especially in Durban. I think the reason why it's also in Durban is just because of Indian families, most of them that they. But I know it's wrong to mention them, but I'm very sorry. But most of the cases when they come to us, especially for gender-based violence, we try to screen them. They're most from Indian families.
That's interesting. And you are saying that it's more difficult to get solidarity networks going within rural, domestic workers in rural areas.
Yes.
Do you have like WhatsApp groups where you support each other in urban areas? Because I know that the majority, up to 80% of domestic workers are actually between Johannesburg, Cape Town, and Durban. So at least in those cities, do we see some sort of solidarity networks amongst domestic workers?
Yes, we do have WhatsApp group, and then we do have Facebook page, and then we have new TikTok, which is starting. So
so domestic workers are on TikTok.
They're on TikTok. And then in TikTok is very nice because you send something and then you know that one of the employers going to.
Yes.
Because our main thing is to end up educating all domestic workers employers. So in our WhatsApp group, we don't have employers. In our Facebook page, they do sometimes, but in our TikTok, we have noticed that they are jumping and seeing and even like following. So it's difficult because right now, even to our WhatsApp group, we have more than 800 people, but our numbers is more. Some of domestic workers, they still don't have smartphones, especially those who are in rural areas. Also, the other thing is because of data. So they're trying to save their data because our WhatsApp group is very busy. There is question now and then. Every time there's a question from another domestic worker, and there's some other domestic workers who experienced what the lady is asking, they are going to respond.
When you mentioned that we call domestic workers helpers, I'm guilty of the same myself. I tend to refer to my. In fact, I was going to say to my helper. Even now, I tend to refer to the lady who works in the house as a helper.
Is not a helper.
She's not a helper.
She's not helping, because if you are helping, you're not getting paid.
Yes.
We are going to be given something whatever your employer want to give it to you. But if you're working, you have a wage, which is your salary. So they're house managers.
In fact, actually, if you go to most of Europe, the reason most people in Europe cannot afford, especially full-time domestic workers, is because it's considered a profession. Actually, it's a recognized, a profession where people opt to be au pairs, opt to, take care of, to be cleaners in people's homes, and they get paid for that. And there isn't this very hierarchical relationship between the worker and the employer. It's like any other, workplace, so to speak. But you started talking about networks and talking about domestic workers belonging to certain groups. Can you tell us a little bit about Izwi and what Izwi does?
Okay, Izwi is an organization started 2017 late. And then the reason why it started, we thought of lots of domestic workers who are being mistreated at work. And then the reason why, there was a lady who, her name was called Sarah, who was working where I was working as well. So this lady, she lost her sister, her biological sister. And then she was supposed to go to Zimbabwe for the burial. And then the employer said, you choose. If you go for the burial, make sure that we are going to replace you. And then she was a breadwinner by that time because she was only the person who was working in the household who's supposed to support the family. So she said, I'm not going to go to bury my sister because I don't want to lose this job. So we're at the park and then she was crying and then we started to talk to her and then she shared her story. And then it's when we started to say, to support her. We supported her until we thought of doing something which can support some other domestic workers, and then it's when Izwi started. And then we are.
It's amazing.
It is. And then the other story, there were two stories, and then one of the domestic worker, she was beaten by the employer. She had a 3-year-old child, and then the employer's son was 16. So she woke up, this child of hers was had the temperature, and then she has to rush to the nearest pharmacy, which is next door. And then when she was out, the employer came in, and then he found that he's a 16-year-old, he's inside by himself. And then when the lady came back, she was beaten just because she left this physical beaten. Even now she can't walk proper. And then it's when we supported those 2 cases until we win those 2 cases. And then it's when Izwi started, we just have that gas that, we can even do it. So we are educating domestic workers about their rights at the same time about their duties, because we believe that I'm not supposed to know my rights before I know my responsibility as a domestic worker. And then when our office is at Hebrew, number 38 at Carvel Outreach Foundation. And then example, when a worker step in to find with a complaint, we first educate the worker to talk to her employer first, because we want to prevent this, that those domestic workers, they have to know to stand up for themselves.
Right.
Yes. So we don't step in and call the employer first. We educate her which words, how to approach your employer, when to approach your employer, what time. And then we educate them to approach their employers. And then when they're not complying with the message from their worker, it's when we step in. And then I'm the one who's doing some negotiating. And then we negotiate with the employer. And then if the employer is not, because we did find out that most of them, they are complying, but they don't even have time to go to the Department of Labor's website to follow the rules of how to hire a domestic worker, just because they don't treat those domestic workers as workers. They just say, I have a helper, so I can do whatever. So the thing is, the employers also want to be educated, just because they have to follow the rules where they are in the Department of Labor's website. So it's what we're doing. And then we do have, every year we have AGM. Yes. And then every week we do have some education about leaves, deductions, UIF, COIDA in our WhatsApp group.
Oh, that's fantastic. And you've been in existence now for how long?
For 5 years.
Okay. And is it a membership-based organization? How big is your membership base, or do domestic workers come to you as and when they need the services?
No, we are preventing that domestic workers come to us when they have a case. We don't want cases. We want them to be educated so that they can prevent those things. Yes. So we want them to know how much they're supposed to earn per hour. Right. When you're earning less than minimum wage, you have to approach your employer and let her know and educate her. And then if she keep on saying, I can't, make sure that we do have an employer's guide and the employee's guide. And then in our employer's guide, we educate employers that they also have their rights. And then in our employees' guide, we educate them that they also have their rights. 2 of them, they have rights. So most of the employers, they know what's supposed to be done, but they don't want to comply. And some of the employers, they don't even know. because they think a domestic worker is not a worker, is a helper.
And I mean, all of those are labor issues, and I suppose they are important. But I think the issue of body violation to their body, whether it's assault, sexual assault, sexual exploitation. I think those issues all need to be brought to the surface. We need to have more organizations, working to help domestic workers. I like the idea of pro bono, legal services. We need more organizations, more civil society organizations prepared to do, some of the pro bono work on behalf of domestic workers.
Yes.
And making sure that they can claim their rights.
Yes, and then the other thing, when it comes to gender-based violence on domestic workers, we don't even know exactly where to go. Because right now we know when it's a labor issue, I can go to CCMA and report. And then, but we don't even know exactly where to go with a gender-based case. Because sometimes we take them to CCMA and then they're going to screen because they are working only with labor issues.
Okay, and so you I suppose you'd have to go to the police, because if it's a case of violence, it has to be dealt with the police.
You go to the police, and then the police, they're working with evidence. Sometimes they're being intimidated, but when you go to the police only need evidence. So when they do the investigation, they can't find anything. You lose your case, and then at the same time, you already lost your job.
Yeah. So there you are. You lose your case, you lose your job. That's the plight of domestic workers, and some of the difficult circumstances they find themselves in, not just from a labor rights perspective, but certainly from a body autonomy and a sexual exploitation perspective. And many of us continue to call them or auntie or CC or helper, and yet they are actually providing a service for which they are paid for, which makes them employers and makes you at home an which makes them employees and makes you at home an employer.
Most of the employers, they go to the bathroom and bath, and then from the bathroom they go naked to their bedroom in front of domestic workers.
That must be seen as a violation of the rights of domestic workers, because that's indecent exposure, right?
At the same time, as domestic workers, we all know that a domestic worker must not be less than 18 years. Must be more than 18 years, which means the person will be an adult. So most of the times employers, because it's their house, it's their privacy, which is fine, sometimes they do touch and kiss in front of the domestic workers during her working hours. While they are not working, it's now after hours from them, but during working hours to a domestic worker, and then they're going to be kissing in front of her, because it's fine, it's their home, but at the same time it's the workplace for this person.
That's a very difficult one to navigate. And I think it speaks to all the issues we've been talking about, the complexity of working in somebody's home, in somebody's private space, where your employer is your HR department, is your finance department, is your employee wellness. So everything is sitting in that one employer. Yes. So you don't have, like you would have in an organization, recourse where you could approach the HR department if you are unhappy with your line manager, for instance. Thank you for highlighting that, because I think it's an important thing that we often forget, and we do prance around our houses naked and as if domestic workers are not people, because it actually it makes them invisible. It suggests that they are invisible, when you do that. But thank you for highlighting that.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you for listening to us, and thank you for following the podcast. Please follow us on Facebook as we bring you more stories relating to gender-based violence over the 16 days of activism, as we explore some of the nuances that different, women under different circumstances experience in relation to domestic violence and gender-based violence. Until the next episode, God bless you and see you next time. Thank you.